biggest stumbling block in negotiations over the future of the new Commonwealth of Independent States. Leaders of the republics will hold a summit meeting tomorrow in Minsk. Russia wants land forces to be kept under a single central command, but 3 of the other republics want their own defence forces.
Boris Yeltsin was giving out awards in Moscow today and also giving out reassurances that his huge Russian Federation will not try to dominate the new Commonwealth. We don't intend to base it on Russia, he said. We're equals among equals. Even so, he confirmed that Russia is pressing ahead with plans to set up its own defence force.
Russia wants to have a national guard of between 30 and 40,000 men. All the documents for it are just about ready.
Mr. Yeltsin signed a cooperation treaty today with Armenia, but behind the smiles, members of the Commonwealth are finding it hard to agree on their military future. Most states want a combined Commonwealth defence force, but some want their own individual armies. In the Belarusian city of Minsk tomorrow, Commonwealth leaders will try to resolve their differences. Troops serving there have mixed views about what should happen to the old Soviet army now. We want all the nationalities of all the states to serve together, said this soldier. His friend agrees there should be one Commonwealth, one defence force. No, said this soldier, each republic should have its own army. The arguments at tomorrow's summit meeting are likely to be intense, but the decisions made there will be critical. The whole military future of the new Commonwealth is being discussed at a time when differences between individual member states are widening with every day that passes. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
President Bush has sent a message to the Russian President Boris Yeltsin wishing him and the leaders of the other Commonwealth states success at their talks tomorrow. Mr. Bush also expressed his willingness to develop close relations with the new Russian government. Here, the Prime Minister will tell
the National Army. He said it'll have at least 30,000 men. Fighting broke out in Georgia today, breaking yesterday's ceasefire. In the capital, Tbilisi, troops loyal to President Gamsahordia drove back rebel forces from the Parliament building.
The ceasefire lasted barely 24 hours before the tanks moved again on the streets of the Georgian capital, Tbilisi. The Republic's president is still refusing to resign. Opposition forces now say that if only a bloody battle will remove him, then they're prepared for just that. The fighting is spreading throughout this historic capital. The Tbilisi Art Gallery and one of the Republic's top schools are among the buildings on fire. Inside the Georgian parliament, President Zvia Gamsahordia is still holed up with several hundred men loyal to him. But increasingly, the various factions in this civil war are turning against his rule. Yesterday's ceasefire had been organized by the former Prime Minister of Georgia, Tengiz Sigua. Now the leader of the opposition, he had persuaded men loyal to the president to change sides and demand Gamsahordia's resignation. When that appeal was turned down today, they agreed to join forces and fight to oust him.
Soccer, Manchester United stay top of the First Division after a 1-1 draw with
economy that's due to start on Thursday would be most painful and unpopular because it would lead to big price rises. It's a forced measure, but there's no other way out, he said. He acknowledged that tension was rising in many parts of Russia, but he urged people not to gamble on violence and start a new civil war.
Boris Yeltsin was giving awards in Moscow today and also giving a promise to his people that life will get better by the second half of next year if his strategy for radical economic reform works. On television tonight, Mr. Yeltsin said that when price controls are lifted this Thursday, it will be painful, but he appealed for patience.
Of course, everyone's nerves are on edge. There's a weariness from the trials of everyday life. But there's a deep understanding that we must not, under any circumstances, gamble on violence.
Mr. Yeltsin said that one step his government is taking is to cut off virtually all aid to foreign countries, an expensive legacy from the old Soviet Union. At home, he's trying to reassure the rest of the new Commonwealth that Russia does not want to dominate. He met the Armenian leader today and signed a cooperation treaty. But behind the smiles, members of the Commonwealth are finding it hard to agree what to do with the military power they've inherited. Most states want a combined Commonwealth defence force, but some want their own individual armies. And even Russia is pressing ahead with its own National Guard.
Russia wants to have a national guard of between 30 and 40,000 men. All the documents for it are just about ready.
In the Belarusian city of Minsk tomorrow, Commonwealth leaders will try to resolve their differences. Troops serving there have mixed views about what should happen to the old Soviet army now. We want all the nationalities of all the states to serve together, said this soldier. His friend agrees there should be one Commonwealth, one defence force. No, said this soldier, each republic should have its own army. The arguments at tomorrow's summit meeting are likely to be intense, but the decisions made there will be critical. The whole military future of the new Commonwealth is being discussed at a time when differences between individual member states are widening with every day that passes. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
Boris Yeltsin's decision to cut foreign aid will hit the economies of several countries. Soviet aid has been decreasing in recent years, particularly to the Third World. But Cuba and Vietnam still receive around £2 billion a year each, and Afghanistan, Angola and Mozambique also get help. The end of financial subsidies from Moscow will be felt hardest in Cuba.
33 years after Fidel Castro seized power, the Western Hemisphere's only communist regime faces its gravest crisis. Over 3/4 of Cuba's trade was with the old Soviet Union. It was all subsidized, the Cubans importing underpriced oil and manufactured goods and exporting overpriced sugar, fruit and nickel. If Cuba now has to pay the market price for imported oil, an already tight system of rationing will be intensified. Already Cubans queue for most foodstuffs and consumer goods. Now the government may have to introduce soup kitchens, electricity rationing and cut petrol for private use. The only alternative might be for the aging Cuban dictator to introduce democratic reforms. But Castro knows elections might end his rule and vows to keep his one-party state. But the end of Russian aid could destroy the patience of Cuba's people. In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen have gained ground since Soviet troops pulled out nearly 3 years ago. But President Najibullah's regime, which they'd been fighting for, continues to receive economic aid, mostly food and fuel. However, some of this comes from the Central Asian republics of the former Soviet Union, who see the Mujahideen as a threat and may keep some supplies flowing. But Boris Yeltsin's decision to cut Russian aid could spell doom for the regimes in Kabul as well as the Cuban capital, Havana.
The ceasefire in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia has broken down, and rebel forces say they're stepping up their efforts to get rid of President Gamsakhourdia. He's been holding out under gunfire in the basement of the parliament building in Tbilisi, even though some of his supporters are now backing demands for him to go.
The Tbilisi hotel, formerly the opposition headquarters, continued to burn out of control today. No fire engines were able to get through the sniper fire. The troops, forced to abandon it last night, have pulled back to a historical institute containing the Lenin Museum. Today they were regrouping and being issued with fresh weapons, having effectively lost ground to the fighters still loyal to President Gamsakhourdia. The opposition leader, Tengiz Kitovani, said one of their number was killed within an hour of the declared ceasefire, a ceasefire which appeared to collapse during the afternoon. Both sides were involved in fierce exchanges of fire. Last night, talks aimed at a peaceful settlement collapsed when none of Mr. Gamsakhourdia's representatives turned up. The opposition are demanding his resignation. So is the leader of the National Guardsmen, who were loyal to the president until last night. The loss of his support is a considerable setback to Mr. Gamsakhourdia. He has up to 400 men under his command.
Come on.
The parliament building where the president is holding out is not completely encircled. His men still control the streets on the hillside above it.
Though the buildings all around are destroyed and smouldering, the parliament itself is almost unscathed. President Gamsakhourdia's bunker is deep below it.
Inside the parliament today, Mr. Gamsakhourdia's supporters insisted there was no question of him giving in to what they called an attempted coup. There is no doubt that he has lost both political and military support, but he still has several hundred well-armed troops, and the building itself, though superficially damaged, has withstood all the opposition has fired at it so far. Surrounded by a large group of heavily armed bodyguards, Mr. Gamsakhourdia himself, looking grey and somewhat shaken, was apparently too busy even to say whether he would fight on. The power struggle here has wrecked much of the heart of the city. A peaceful solution appears to be as remote as ever. Carol Walker, BBC News, Tbilisi.
Here, the Prime Minister will tell voters in his New Year message that Britain is now seeing the first signs of economic recovery.
Officials at the summit of 11 former Soviet republics in Minsk tonight said agreement had been reached on a unified command for nuclear forces. But there have been stormy debates on banking and prices. And the key problem of how to divide up the former Soviet Union's conventional military forces remains unsolved.
Minsk was the birthplace of the new Commonwealth. Boris Yeltsin arrived there declaring that nothing and no one can threaten its future. But he and its other leaders are finding it much more difficult to agree how their new alliance should work than they did to bury the old Soviet Union. The Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk is leading the challenge to Mr. Yeltsin's ideas about how things should be done. The immediate arguments are about military control and economic reform. But behind today's discussions lies a dispute about the degree to which the new Commonwealth will be dominated by Mr. Yeltsin and Russia. The question of control over the armed forces of the old Soviet Union was high on the agenda, not just the men but the assets. The future of the powerful Black Sea Fleet has already divided Russia and the Ukraine. Mr. Yeltsin says Russia has historic rights to it. The Ukrainians say they are determined to be a maritime power. Of more pressing concern to the West, the control of nuclear weapons. Latest but unconfirmed reports from Minsk say the 11 republics have endorsed a plan for joint control. But the former Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze has warned that nuclear missiles could fall into the hands of paramilitary groups. And he said the West should be, as he put it, terrorized by the uncertainty. There are reports coming out of the meeting of what are described as stormy debates about plans for economic reform. The most immediate source of discord, the Russian government's proposal to deregulate prices later this week, which the Ukrainians oppose. And it's beginning to look as if they won't be able to settle that tonight. There's talk now of a second day of negotiation tomorrow.
A relief convoy carrying food and medicine donated by Britons, Americans and Germans has arrived in Russia after a 700-mile journey. The convoy left Berlin on Friday, guarded by Red Army troops to prevent looting. It reached the Russian city of Smolensk this morning. ITN's Paul Davis was there.
It was a marathon trek across a frozen Eastern Europe, the humanitarian convoy travelling from Germany through Poland into what used to be the Soviet Union, where for millions hard winter presents more immediate problems than even the current political turmoil. On the way, the trucks were invited into the huge Russian army barracks at Brest near the Polish border. The soldiers wanted to show their gratitude to the foreigners carrying food and medicine for their countrymen in need. Children of British servicemen who were accompanying the aid convoy were introduced to the young conscripts who are waiting to see what form their disintegrating Red Army will take. Then souvenir photographs of young East meets West, unthinkable just a few months ago. The British and American families were given a taste of army food Russian style. A British piper played for his supper to the obvious amusement of his hosts, before the 15 vehicles loaded with food, medicine and clothing moved on into another foul night on the Russian highway, stopping only to refuel by the roadside as temperatures plummeted. This morning, 2 days and almost 1,000 miles after setting off from Berlin, the convoy reached its destination, the ancient Russian city of Smolensk, where the Metropolitan, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in the region, was waiting to express his thanks and outline the plight of his people.
The people have nothing, really nothing. We haven't enough bread, we haven't enough meat, we haven't fish, we haven't vegetables, and of course the medical supplies also.
The people of Smolensk are planning their own thank you to their foreign benefactors with a service in the historic cathedral. Tomorrow, the British team will distribute aid to hospitals, schools and to Russian families. They're already hoping to stage a much larger scale relief operation early in the new year. Paul Davis, ITN, Smolensk.
2 Americans killed by their Lebanese kidnappers received full military honours at an airbase near Washington this afternoon.
Republics have agreed on the control of strategic weapons, but after talks lasting all day, there's no deal yet on conventional arms and deep divisions too on economic reform. 200 leaders of the Commonwealth of Independent States are said to have reached agreement on the control of their strategic nuclear weapons, but the details of the agreement are not yet known, including who has control of the nuclear trigger. There's no deal yet on conventional forces. Several republics are insisting on keeping control of the Navy and Air Forces on their territory. And on economic reforms, some states are angry at Russia's plans to lift price controls. They fear it will damage their economies.
Boris Yeltsin set off for Minsk, well aware that the Commonwealth he co-founded only 3 weeks ago is already running into trouble. He put a brave face on it, though, insisting that nothing and no one threaten its future. But the truth is that unless relations between member states become more harmonious, the Commonwealth could fall apart. There's an increasingly bitter rivalry between Russia and Ukraine, whose leader, Leonid Kravchuk, wants to create a separate army, and he confirmed today to take over much of the Black Sea naval fleet. He accused Mr. Yeltsin of violating the spirit of the Commonwealth by pressing ahead with radical economic reform and raising prices before other states are ready. So on the key issues of defence and the economy, this new community is divided, and it's having to work hard to paper over the cracks. Today, the 11 leaders needed to reassure both their own people and the outside world that their infant Commonwealth is viable, that it wasn't just a device for killing off the old Soviet Union and for forcing Mr. Gorbachev into retirement. But as they went into their talks, Kazakhstan said Russia must not be allowed to become the big brother of the Commonwealth, and progress today was said to have been slow and difficult. Patience, though, is needed, according to the former Soviet foreign minister.
In 2 weeks, in a month, even in a year, you can't achieve a transition which is painless. It's just not realistic. Look how long it's taken the European community. Decades. And they still argue when they're deciding fundamental questions.
Despite some tough arguments today, leaders of the Commonwealth did agree on unified control over nuclear weapons. But there's still disagreement on conventional forces. There'll have to be another meeting in the new year, which is why Marshal Yevgeny Shapashnikov has only been appointed Commonwealth Commander-in-Chief for another 2 months. It does not seem to indicate stability or certainty. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
Fierce street battles between rebel and government
of independent states have endorsed a single command of nuclear weapons, but they've agreed to disagree about setting up a joint conventional army. After 8 hours of talks in the Commonwealth's new capital, Minsk, 3 of the former Soviet republics, Ukraine, Azerbaijan and Moldova, said they'd be setting up their own separate armed forces. Our diplomatic editor, Edward Sturton in London, has our report.
They had to show the world that they could sign something, that there is a will to make the new Commonwealth work. But the agreements they reached today were modest when measured against the tasks they face, and the tone of the discussions, described as stormy at times, suggests increasing tension between the 2 most powerful republics, Boris Yeltsin's Russia and Leonid Kravchuk's Ukraine. They say they're of one mind on the issue that most worries the West, the control of nuclear weapons. Boris Yeltsin announced after the meeting that strategic weapons will come under the control of a council of Commonwealth heads of state. But they haven't yet worked out how the new system will operate. And as they talked, the former Soviet foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, was warning that nuclear weapons could fall into the hands of paramilitaries and telling Western leaders they should be terrified.
I think we could take some comfort that at the moment, while there is concern about the attitude that President Yeltsin may be taking in certain respects, they do seem at the moment to see the good sense in a unified single control for nuclear weapons. That has to be right.
Boris Yeltsin scornfully dismissed the idea that the Commonwealth is about to disintegrate. But he admitted that on the question of conventional forces, they've simply had to agree to go their separate ways. Some republics want to establish their own defense forces. The Ukrainians have already begun to train a National Guard. Mr. Yeltsin said today they could do so despite the fact that most republics, including Russia, want central control of what were the Soviet armed forces. But what divided them more than anything else today was the pace of economic reform. They could agree neither on immediate steps, like the Russian plan to abandon price controls on Thursday, nor on a longer-term economic structure for the Commonwealth. They've had to set up another meeting in a fortnight to try again.
A team from ITN's Channel 4 News has become the first Western camera crew to see the place where the former Soviet Union's nuclear bombs were developed and made. The secret city is 900 miles from Moscow, near Chelyabinsk. A series of accidents and a nuclear explosion there released more radiation than the Chernobyl disaster.
2 hours out of Ekaterinburg, the road is blocked. No Western cameras have been allowed here before. Beyond the gates, a city that appears on no maps, it has no name. The people call it simply the city. But the gate is guarding the secret that made the Soviet Union a superpower. Mayak, the country's first and biggest atomic bomb factory, Stalin's answer to America's nuclear weapons program. On the gates, the figures 235, uranium-235, the stuff of atomic bombs. The 5 reactors are now shut down. The last 2, they say, closed this year. The arms race began and ended at Mayak. We found a legacy that amounts to a human and environmental disaster. Next to the factory, lead-lined trucks are loaded with rock. They're taking it to a lake called Karachai. Outside the core of a nuclear reactor, this is the most radioactive place on Earth. Nuclear waste has been dumped untreated into the lake for decades. Now it's being filled in. Radiation levels are so high, the drivers can spend only 3 minutes here. In 1957, Mayak was the scene of the worst nuclear disaster until Chernobyl. One of the waste tanks here exploded, contaminating 8,000 square miles of countryside. 23,000 people were evacuated. 50 kilometers from the plant, the bridge at Maslumovo crosses the frozen river Techa. Another 7.5 million curies of untreated nuclear waste have been washed downstream from Mayak. 20 villages have been evacuated. But in Maslumovo, children are still playing on the ice. Radiation levels are 8 times higher than normal, more than enough to endanger their lives. The authorities confirm almost 1,000 cases of radiation sickness, a 40% increase in leukemia, and more babies dying. In opening the gates of the secret city, in beginning the long, expensive task of cleaning up the mess left by the Cold War, the Russians are seeking cooperation from those that Mayak was created to destroy. Andrew Veach, ITN, Mayak.
Here, a 70-year-old woman who is wheelchair-bound.
On the air for half an hour with a roundup of the main news in Britain and around the world. In the programme this Thursday lunchtime, the man shot dead by police, now from Bradford. Style market economy today. The government subsidies, which have kept prices down for 70 years, have been swept away as the Russian President Boris Yeltsin tries to radically reform the country's economy. The reforms are meant to put goods back in the shops and help do away with the black market and barter economy. But today, most shelves were still bare. Freeing prices has made many essential items too expensive for many shoppers. From this morning, even bread prices tripled. The average worker takes home 350 rubles a month. That's about £4.30. From today, a pound of sausages costs 80 pence a pound. Most people would have to work, in theory, about 34 hours to afford that. Milk is now 5 times more expensive, 40 pence a litre, 15 hours work. And a woman wanting to buy a pair of tights would have to work 60 hours to earn the £1.30 needed to buy them.
They remonstrated with the shop assistants, inspected the new prices carefully. And some left empty-handed, unable to afford what they'd come for. I simply can't survive on a pension, declared one man. It's daylight robbery, stealing from the honest, complained another. Some prices had jumped even more than the 3, 4 or 5 times they'd expected. This butter was selling for 8 times the price it could have been bought for yesterday. These are the sort of sums that make nonsense of the incomes of most Russians.
A kilo of cheese now costs me twice my monthly pension.
The people so angry, and they are not afraid of anything right now, like before. We're cursing everybody. We lost the trust in anybody. We lost their hopes. I'm afraid of street riots, and I'm afraid that the military will come again, and we will see something terrible.
Boris Yeltsin is gambling that by putting up the prices in the shops, he'll provide profits for producers, giving them incentives to turn out more goods and become more efficient. But his critics argue that the Russian economy isn't ready for that kind of shock therapy because the process of privatization simply hasn't got off the ground. 98% of Russian enterprises are still owned by the state. This bakery is among them. And 70% of them have a monopoly in their field, so not much incentive for competition. Add to that the difficulties of working with outdated equipment and the other legacies of 7 decades of communism.
Psychologically, we are not ready for the free market. Today we have stepped into the free market, but we still have yesterday's mentality. Having found ourselves in the freedom, we're still unable to comprehend the meaning of this freedom.
On day one of Russia's new world of the market economy, at this shop it is an old story. The doors are closed because there's nothing to sell. No evidence here that freeing prices will fill the shelves. Edward Sturton, ITN, Moscow.
Edward Sturton joins us now from Moscow. Ed, as you said in your report, these reforms are aimed at stimulating the economy, particularly production. But what is there to stimulate?
Well, I think the real problem is that it's not, what we've got today is not what any economist would recognise as a free market. Talked a little bit in the piece you've just seen about the problems of the lack of competition, but even the price rises aren't really free market forces at work. They're not decided by the market. They're price rises decided by the central government in the good old-fashioned way. So there are real doubts about whether this experiment will actually work.
Some of those doubts, as your report showed, are shared by some of the people who are closest to Boris Yeltsin. He seems to be surrounded by people who don't actually think he's got it right. Does he seem to have it right? Is he in control?
Well, one of the remarkable things about the new Russia is that a system in which really nobody could criticize the government at all has been replaced by one in which even members of the government can criticize its leadership. And certainly you will hear Yeltsin supporters, people who were inspired by what he did last year during the coup against President Gorbachev, who are now saying they're disenchanted with him, that he hasn't shown he can manage the economy. One even said to us that he was fiddling while Rome burns, in the manner of Nero.
There's also some speculation here that there's a major push on the part of Mr. Major and Mr. Bush to get Yeltsin on board at the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund and so on. Is there a danger, Ed, that he's going to go the road of Gorbachev, carving out a niche for himself on the international stage, whilst at home the whole thing unravels?
Well, one thing that Mr. Yeltsin has shown is that he's got a very sure populist touch. He's not likely to lose touch with the feelings of the people in the way that President Gorbachev did. But the Gorbachev lesson is a good one, because what it tells us is that however successful you are, if you don't deliver the goods at home, the people will in the end turn against you. And there is, as we've said earlier, a very big question mark over whether Boris Yeltsin can deliver the goods with these economic reforms.
Ed, thanks very much indeed. And I'm sorry we had some interference on the satellite there from Moscow. Now here, share prices in the city are rising again today, the first day of trading since the
shelves. The lasting image of the failure of the old communist system of centralized price controls marked the start of Boris Yeltsin's economic gamble in Russia and the Ukraine. But what was on sale was substantially more expensive. Carrots, boiled sausage and pizza, for example, all up 5 times. Milk, bread and cheese up 3 times. As well as food, the cost of fares and fuel have also risen. Mr. Yeltsin has warned of considerable hardship ahead as prices and wages find their own level in the free market, in the hope that it will end the chronic economic ills of his country.
Today, decades of artificial price subsidies here are being abandoned. Shoppers this morning stared in disbelief at what they now have to pay for the most basic goods. Sausage costs 100 rubles a kilo. That's a week's wages for most people. This fish is 42 rubles, a couple of days' pay, while a bottle of wine is 45 rubles. There'll still be some price controls on products like butter, salt and milk, but even these are going up today by some 300%. One of the brains behind this shock therapy reform program is the British economist Richard Layard, who's now working here in Moscow as an advisor to Boris Yeltsin.
The Russian population at the moment spends almost as much time queuing as it does working. This is a complete absurdity. Nothing functions, and therefore prices have to be freed. When they're free, the queues will, in a reasonable period, disappear. So this is a major landmark in post-war history. Russia is adopting the key principle of a Western economy.
The theory is the same as it was with the Polish experiment, that higher prices will eventually attract goods back into the shops, and that when capitalist competition is introduced, prices will be forced back down again. The problem is that it'll all take time. Today, the queues are as long as ever, and the shelves are just as empty. Shoppers here are bitterly angry.
I never thought things would turn out like this, and to be honest, I'm now sorry I voted for Yeltsin.
It's theft. Theft, I tell you. Okay, so pensions have doubled, but prices are 10, 15, 20 times higher.
Until now, the most thriving economy here has been the black market. Mr. Yeltsin's advisors hope that supplies which have been held back for private sale will now become available to all as prices are allowed to find their natural level. In the short term, though, it will lead to inflation of around 150% this month alone, and some fear it will fuel hyperinflation. Pensions and minimum wages are going up in compensation, but not as much as prices are. Shoppers like Alexander Livigant and his daughter are relatively well off and won't be as badly hit as many, but he's still sceptical about how quickly these reforms will work.
I think we are in too deep a hole to get out of it in a couple of months. I think it would take years, and many years, to get on at least better than we do now.
Whether Russians like it or not, capitalism is coming to their country. Boris Yeltsin knows he's taking a gamble, because as prices soar, his popularity is certain to slide. But Mr. Yeltsin is setting the pace for economic reform in the new Commonwealth, and the other states are struggling to keep up. There is real resentment here today, but so far no signs of social unrest, and that at least will be a relief to Boris Yeltsin. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
Police in West Yorkshire have confirmed that a man shot dead by police.
To a system much more like ours, where the price of things in the shops is decided by how much they cost to grow or make, and by what people are willing to pay for them. This market is one of the few places in Moscow that has plenty of fresh food. It's part of the experiment set up by President Gorbachev, allowing people to run their own businesses for the first time. Prices here were set by how much people were willing to pay. Russia's President Boris Yeltsin hopes that with all the shops now operating in the same way, every shelf will soon be as well stocked as this. But the president predicts it'll be about 6 to 8 months before prices settle down. He says till then, life will be painful, but hopefully afterwards, it'll be much better than it was before.
For the first time, anglers in England and Wales can...
Welcome to the market, comrade. Russia discovers you can't meet demand with promises. Good evening. Mikhail Gorbachev once said there are no rehearsals in history. Russia today leapt unprepared into the free market. The risks are huge.
I'll be reporting from Moscow on the day that Boris Yeltsin's Russia took a bold and perilous leap from the wreckage of communism to seek salvation in the free market economy. They could fall and fail, and they are asking the West to help them.
So what'll the response of the West be? I've been asking the Foreign Secretary how far Britain's prepared to go to help Russia and how he expects the European community to develop in the face of external challenge. And is it time to toughen up the law on dangerous driving? Victims' families say a 6-month sentence and a £250 fine are no punishment for a driver who kills a child.
I was appalled. I was disgusted.
Into the free market today. Bread became 4 times as expensive. That other Russian staple sausage doubled or trebled in price. Electricity will cost 9 times as much. The idea is to use the mechanism of the market to catapult the country into the future. So far, the people seem stunned more than anything else. In St. Petersburg, 4 out of every 5 shops greeted the event by staying closed. There's no question of the press of demand, but if supply doesn't meet it, there are dire warnings of unrest to come. David Sells has been in Moscow over the Christmas holiday and watched the price rises take effect today.
Russian families baked their way into the new year with traditional gusto, though nobody cared to think too deeply about what 1992 had in store. The Zinchenkos, a humble Moscow family in a humble Moscow flat, were no exception. Boris Yeltsin, their popular president, has warned them that it will be rough going. Why doubt him?
I don't think they can fill the stores in one day.
Well, I wouldn't like to think about it now on the New Year's Eve. I think that our salaries will be increased not much and the prices will go up.
The Zinchenkos are stocked up for a siege. Years of distorted food supply have taught them to buy when they can, pickle for safekeeping, and store wherever there's a spare space. So they and their guests ushered out 1991, a year in which the daily battle for survival grew palpably more grim, and toasted in the new year, exchanging troubled certainty for the wholly unknown. 4 generations of Zinchenkos lived together, ranging from 4-year-old Denis to his great-grandmother, who was 9 when Lenin launched his revolution. The boy's father, Vadim, is a trainee driver on the Moscow Underground, who gave up soldiering last year because he saw no future in a shrunken army. For the land of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, 1992, in which Russia rejoins the world, promises to be a year of epic convulsion. Today's brutal reform puts paid to a communist era which finally went bankrupt, leaving the Zinchenkos and their like to pick up the pieces. The architects of an economic reform, which one way or another will ultimately turn the Zinchenkos' lives upside down, are a team of young Turks to whom President Yeltsin has given their head. Some of them were on show earlier this week, presenting government plans for privatizing Russia. Their leader and Yeltsin's chief economic guru is Yegor Gaidar.
Now that the decree has been signed by Yeltsin, we have the sound legal framework to move forward in order to enable us to sell state property and develop private enterprise.
Gaidar and his team are Thatcherite to the core. They've come up with a crash program of reform, the most drastic the world has seen. There is, they say, no alternative. Russia is on the brink of economic collapse, gripped by massive inflation, its state coffers almost empty. Gaidar and co. spoke from a stage which, in the course of a single year, has seen the rise and rise of Boris Yeltsin, the miserable coup leaders who plotted against him and failed, and finally Mr. Gorbachev, whose chronic dithering has left Russia so totally in the soup. The team's task is to transform from a standing start a sick system of state monopolies into a stable free market economy, and to do it, please, without provoking riots.
The serious problem will be the combination of the very rapid price increase and the persistence of the shortages. This situation is reality. We are in the most optimistic variant. At least 3 weeks of the next year will be the weeks of the combination of the very serious price increase and the persistent shortages. Now, for the first days of the year, we will of course use all of our reserves, including military reserves, to provide the necessary basic commodities. And of course, we, from the longer term perspective, we hope that the serious market-oriented reforms could create the internal market for the basic foodstuffs.
The problem is that they have to do all these things almost simultaneously. Of course, it would be much better if we can first demonopolize and privatize our economy and then liberalize prices. It is a classic scenario. But unfortunately, our situation is absolutely unclassic. And any classic scenario cannot work now in Russia. Boris Yeltsin has to be a strong leader and to use even reasonably authoritarian steps and means in order to control the situation. And his government now is preparing to act in any situation, including critical one.
Russia, rich as it is, intrinsically in gold and diamonds and oil, is nevertheless on its beam ends, down to its last bag of jelly beans. A fact that the shoppers, most of them, barely comprehend as they endure their mundane travail of hunting for food and eternally queuing.
I think this price reform won't help greatly. I don't know who has done it and what was the reason behind it. I think that food will appear closer to summer.
We are simple people. I don't know much about politics. All I need now is food, is bread. Then it is possible to live. It was worse during the war. We survived everything, and now it is still possible to live and to make life better in future.
It was necessary to raise prices. Our former leaders ruined our economy, but now everything will be better. Yes, I think many people will support this policy.
The lifting today at one fell swoop of almost all price controls is politically dynamite and economically a desperate gamble. A loaf of bread, wheat bread that is, a staple food, went up in Moscow from 60 kopecks to 2 rubles 60 kopecks, a rise of 4.5 times. Massive. But 2 rubles 60 at the realistic free market exchange rate is still only 1.5 English p for a loaf, quite some way from the cost of production. At this shop, they couldn't even be bothered to change the price of rye bread. The reforms, though, if they work, and it is a very big if, will return Russia to the living world, where shop prices are related to production costs and where rubles can be traded for foreign currencies. At its best, it will be a very rough ride, a huge burden for a long-suffering people.
You would not really expect the general public support for the price increase, for the price liberalization, for the very high open inflation. But I think generally public supports it. And if it will not be a terrible problems with the material flows of the resources, especially foodstuffs, I think we can survive politically during this very dangerous first month of a comprehensive economic reform program.
Food is the key.
Food, yes, food is the key. And food and small amount of essential industrial import necessary not to stop all of our industry.
Soviet man long ago learned to move in mysterious ways to tap the twisted system. Anton's mother-in-law in Moldavia has access to a new car, a perk of being a factory's doctor, for 18,000 rubles, a knockdown price, about a fifth of what he'd have to pay on Moscow's second-hand market for the grubby object both of us were examining. If Anton could sell his French refrigerator, another of mother-in-law's perks, on Moscow's free market, he could buy that new car. Tell me something, why have you been unable to borrow the 18,000 rubles that you would need to buy the car?
It's really difficult because nobody would lend you such a sum of money because ruble becomes cheaper almost every day.
So nobody's willing to lend money at the moment because of the inflation.
Almost nobody would lend me such a sum of money in rubles.
The trouble is, the refrigerator is still in Moldavia and now would have to be smuggled out. One refrigerator equals one car. It's this sort of lopsided equation that Russia's reformers are trying to stamp out. Today's Russian money, anyway, is a snare and a delusion, as I found in Moscow's main tourist bank, which is why the reformers are trying to make it convertible. There were no rubles for sale, even for dollars or Deutschmarks. The bank had run dry.
Why change 50?
Sorry, sir, I cannot change your money. У меня нет рублей, извините.
No more?
No more, please.
Why no rubles?
I don't know.
When will you have rubles again?
I think today, nowhere.
Not today?
Yeah, not today.
Tomorrow? Will it be the same rate of exchange?
The rate is 90 rubles per $1.
90 to the dollar. That's almost the free market rate, isn't it?
And you think tomorrow?
Yeah, tomorrow, yes, we're open.
What time?
At 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock.
Yeah.
And you'll have rubles then?
Yes.
All right, okay. Thank you.
The answer to the paradox of a bank without rubles in a land awash with them, with inflation verging on the hyper at more than 200%, is that with wages and pensions leaping up ahead of today's price free for all, ruble demand simply outstripped supply, just as demand for hard currencies has left Russia with almost no foreign reserves, a demeaning plight for a nation of this size. Maybe it was with some such thought in mind, the need generally to woo the West, that Moscow's reforming mayor threw a New Year's Eve party at the Kremlin for 200 visiting American businessmen. Not an occasion they will forget. The Kremlin at night is breathtaking. It took a moment to remember that Mr. Gorbachev and his communist apparat have been tossed out bag and baggage, though Lenin lives on, addressing young communists in 1920, a ghostly portrait presence who all along has shared the Kremlin's walls with vivid religious icons. The occasion was a fundraiser for a new American business school in Moscow, of which Mayor Popov is patron. Many of his Russian guests were seeing the inside of the Kremlin for the first time. Moscow's Metropolitan is now de rigueur for such evenings. Reformers of all shapes and sizes were present. Somewhere there, too, lurked the spirit of Russia, crying for help, for Western help, as Boris Yeltsin's men blitz their way towards the dream of a market economy. The mayor himself thinks they've got their reform package the wrong way round. Price liberalization before the ground had been prepared by privatization and other measures.
There was no alternatives. Price liberalization was necessary. But the whole complex of more broad reorganization measures should have gone together with it.
No time, say Yeltsin's men, for such niceties. And Mr. Popov, who'd threatened to resign, conceded that he'd already composed his differences with President Yeltsin.
We came to an agreement with Yeltsin. He signed the decision on privatization and agricultural reform. So we have a base for cooperation.
It was a Kremlin farewell to an era. And to match today's sweeping price liberalization, Russia took a monetary leap, floating the ruble, making it internally convertible against foreign currencies, sweeping away a tangle of artificial exchange rates. When the ruble eventually settles down, Russia's central bank will need help in the form of a substantial stabilization fund of dollars to manage fluctuations, by March at the latest, and coughed up by a hitherto skeptical and parsimonious West.
From the longer-term perspective, to a 3-month perspective, it is the stabilization fund for the stabilization for the ruble convertibility.
How big a fund do you require?
$5 billion will be a realistic amount of money necessary for the defense of a realistic rate of exchange of ruble.
Provided by G7?
Yes.
Without this fund, the reform will fail. Russians need bread, and Muscovites are eating more of it to make up for lack of other foods. But to bake the bread, you need the grain. To import the grain, you need the ships. And for ships, you have to pay freight charges. So strapped for hard currency is Russia today that these freight costs have become a national priority.
Food import on the food credits that we agreed should proceed without any hesitations. We have a very serious problems with the shipments connected with the liquidity crisis, with the payment for the freight. If West can help in this area, and it is really not a major amount of money, it will be very helpful. we practically have no cash. To tell you the truth, every cash we have, we now are using only to the payment of the interest that we are paying to the West.
We should create money that everybody would like to earn. Otherwise, we can do nothing with our economy. But at the same time, it is a great test for everybody, for all people, for our democracy, for Boris Yeltsin personally and his government, because it is really very hard to comprehend for common people. Why to support democracy if it cannot feed the people? Why to support reforms and Boris Yeltsin when the life is becoming harder and harder? Why? And unfortunately, this potential of support is almost exhausted now.
To end the queues and the monstrous disequilibriums of Russian life, Mr. Yeltsin has undertaken a huge gamble, that of radical reform. Unlike Mr. Gorbachev, he is doing things. But there are still a host of dangerously loose ends. Subsidies must be ended, credit cut, and land reform actively pursued. If Western help is unforthcoming, his advisors say, the whole project will be sunk.
David Sells in Moscow. Well, elsewhere in the Soviet Union, or the erstwhile Soviet Union, the scale of economic instability is matched only by the political tensions. Today, there are reports that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry has decided to take control of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, one of the 4 big fleets of the Red Navy. In Georgia, rebels besieging President Zviad Gamsakhurdia have formed a joint military council to try to take over the government and declared a curfew in Tbilisi. The threat of disintegration in the East will dominate the calculations of Western governments in the coming months. Not only in Russia, but in Yugoslavia as well, the map is being redrawn, and the leaders of the European Union, as we shall soon have to learn to call the European Community, must try to agree on how to cope with the threat of chaos on its borders. In Britain, of course, uncertainty is compounded, as no one knows who'll be in charge of foreign policy by the end of this election year. Earlier today, I spoke to the Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, in his Oxfordshire constituency. Foreign Secretary, a year ago, the talk was all of a new world order, and there was a degree of optimism about, although we stood on the brink of the Gulf War, there was a sense that somehow, the Cold War being over, we were on the verge of a new era of potential international understanding and cooperation. It doesn't look like that at the start of 1992, does it?
I never really thought it looked like that then. I never used that phrase. Of course, if you look at some things, like the Arab-Israel dispute, Cambodia, like El Salvador, like South Africa, they are, as it were, yielding to treatment. But I think people were too optimistic about Central and Eastern Europe. It is taking longer, and it's more painful to move from one system, a bad system, to another system, a good system.
There is the real prospect in Russia, the Ukraine, and associated states of possibly civil war. How far are we prepared to go to prevent that?
We don't have a decisive influence. I'm talking about we, the outside West. They realize the danger now. They've looked into the abyss, and that is why you now have the Minsk Agreement and the notion of a Commonwealth, because they realize that otherwise they might head back to where they were, what, 1919, 1920, in a civil war.
But if there are serious food shortages, there is likely to be civil unrest, and that could easily escalate into something else. Now, how far are we prepared to go to try to ensure that doesn't happen?
Well, we're prepared to put in food. And John Major, as the chairman of the Group of Seven until the day before yesterday, coordinated that effort. And there's a lot of food going in. There's 1.4 billion EC, and we're producing 300 million sterling worth of that. And actual food is going in, for example, to St. Petersburg this week. So we are prepared to do our bit, but our bit is a limited one compared to what the Russians, Ukrainians, others have to do by working together themselves.
Don't you think there is a case for something like a Marshall Plan?
Well, there's a case for helping people who have taken the measures which are necessary. The trouble all through these last years, when people have put that question to me or to the Prime Minister, is that there hasn't been anyone on the other end of the rope. There haven't been people actually carrying out the necessary reforms. Now the Russian government, President Yeltsin's government, has taken some very brave, basic decisions. Whether they're going to work out exactly as planned is not something I can judge, but they have taken some basic reforming decisions about the economy. And therefore they are putting themselves into a position where, as I said, if they consult the IMF, go along with kind of disciplines which other countries in the world have had to do, they are going to qualify for international understanding and help. There's no good putting into money into something where there isn't a plan. That's the old story of the hole in the pocket.
But in terms of declarations of intent and apparent willingness to act upon those declarations of intent, they have surely met all our basic requirements now.
What they're getting now is food aid, food credits to buy food, including food for animals so that there's meat and dairy produce, technical assistance, for example, our know-how fund. And what the third stage is the one you and I are now talking about. They really get into stabilization of the ruble, convertibility of the ruble, but then they really do need to get alongside the IMF and the world financial system, and that's not yet happened.
Now, Britain is to discuss the question of Russia, its relation to the old Soviet Union's seat on the Security Council, the meeting of leaders of Security Council members in New York. When you look at Britain summoning that meeting and you look at our new relationship with Europe, I wonder whether you don't think that we should perhaps give up our seat on the Security Council to the European community.
Well, we're not summoning that meeting. It's an idea that we're exploring with our friends. It seemed to the Prime Minister, to me, a sensible idea to explore with others, but there's been no decision about it. We talked before Maastricht, and indeed at Maastricht, about the Security Council, and we and the French worked out with our other partners what I think is a perfectly sensible arrangement. We have these two permanent seats. They're a result of history, but they're also very important for Europe and for us. So we intend to hold on to them, but we intend, in exercising our responsibilities in the Security Council, to take account of agreements which are reached among the 12 about the way foreign policy should go forward.
The fact that in, for example, issues like the recognition of Croatia and Slovenia, the running appears now to be made entirely by Germany, seems to indicate to some people that it is perhaps time that we ceded that seat and handed it over into some sort of European seat.
Of course the Germans are, economically, are very strong. They're the strongest member of the community, and I think that will probably remain so. But they have inhibitions in their constitution and in their policy about intervening in the outside world for reasons which we all understand. So that, you know, that has to be taken into account too. I don't think there's any particular pressure on this point. What we all realize is that no one is constraining, no one is saying that France, Britain and Germany can't have separate policies in Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union. If we wanted to, we could. But we all realize that if we're actually going to have some impact on what happens in the east of our continent, we really have to work together. If we haven't learned that from the history of this century, we haven't learned anything. So that is what we're trying to do. Sometimes it's quite hard work, but we all know that it's necessary if we're going to be effective. If we're just interested in our own headlines and in little bits of self-indulgence, of course we'd all go off and do our own things, have our own clients, support our own republic in Yugoslavia, our own bit of the Balkans, but it doesn't make any sense, really. So that's why we're trying to come together, not through majority voting, not through legal compulsion, but come together and work out these things, just as yesterday we all recognized together 8 of the new Soviet republics.
But on the question of Croatia and Slovenia, there we were in November thinking it was a bad idea, and in December doing it and putting it into effect this month.
In November we were saying it was a matter of judgment and timing, a phrase I often use, because I could see it coming. It's not a matter of principle. There was a disagreement about timing. The Germans held off a long time because of that. Anyway, it was a compromise in the end. But for the reason I've given, it really doesn't make sense in Yugoslavia or in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, for the countries of Western Europe to go off in different directions, doing different things, backing different people, getting back into the old rivalries.
And doesn't that eventually mean that it is the German superstate which is increasingly going to call the shots in Europe?
Well, that's not what any German politician would, no German politician would say yes to that. They're very conscious of the difficulties of saying yes to that, and they don't want to say yes to that. They felt strongly about Croatia and Slovenia, that's quite right. But I've certainly found, in talking about the problems of the former Soviet Union,